All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for Design Summer Sessions. Today, we are talking about roles and possibly responsibilities that go along with those roles. And I am going to first pass it over to Juan to talk about the topic. And then Lyndsey is joining us from BBG. We'll give a quick introduction.
Cool. Thank you, Jason. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. Juan, designer and artist out of the Chicago suburbs, lover of type, hater of mustard.
Mm.
Let's just be frank. And today's topic is about roles and responsibility. Specifically, when it comes to progression in a career, does everyone need to become an art director, a creative entrepreneur, all of a sudden within the first 5 years? Or is there more of a linear or static progression that needs to be held within roles and titles at a studio, present, independent?
Thank you. And then Lyndsey, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Lyndsey. I'm the project manager here at BBG. So I handle all things project management, both internal and external, all client-facing responsibilities, as well as making sure there's no fires internally and the train stays on the tracks.
And you work with every role
Yes.
on the design side and internal side. So you definitely will be able to add to that.
Yes.
So one thing that I just wanted to start off with, which I think is an interesting, before we get into some nitty gritties on roles, not everybody wants to be a manager. Not everybody wants to take a certain path. So right off the bat, when you think about career progression, and I have seen companies do a great job at this. There are some people who just want to be the raw power at their job, but don't want to oversee or manage a team. They would rather focus in one space than go the other way, which is as you grow, you learn, and you could help mentor or oversee a team. So I think that that's worth noting right off the bat, is that there is a progression of job that continues to grow roles and responsibilities without moving more into a management position. There are companies that have that. And if you don't want to manage people, which probably 5 of every 10 creatives do not want to do, there is that opportunity to find those companies.
Yeah.
All right. So Juan, kick us off with some questions.
Well, the first question was regarding that, but I think you already answered it for me.
Wow.
So just a little bit of background. When I was in my first role as a junior designer, just starting out, and I had a manager who was great. He was a great mentor. He knew how to manage people and he was very good at it. But he also, like you were mentioning, maybe he didn't want to manage people. And so he kind of took a step. Some people would say it's a step backward, right? From a different perspective. But I would say he took a step forward and he, put himself out there and said, I would much rather lead and mentor people from an independent contributor role that's on the higher end, but not necessarily dealing with like, you know, higher ups and HR, discrepancies.
Company
The way I'm
below.
describing it is very niche,
Yeah.
but
Well, let me
basically,
ask you, let me ask
yeah.
you a question. What would be considered a step forward or a step back, knowing that life progresses and that companies change just like you change?
Yeah.
What would you consider it to be? There's factors, but I'm interested to kind of hear from you.
Yeah. I think a step forward would be if you are deliberating um, better time and you're more sensible to your work-life balance. So if he, for example, was unhappy with being a manager and kind of the responsibilities that carries within that role, and he now prioritizes, being fulfilled in the work that he's doing and being engaged in the type of responsibilities that he has, I think that is a success in itself, because that means like he would be happier in one aspect of his life, not just career. I think a career isn't the be all end all of living a good life. You know, I think it's a fulfillment, and, you know, it's something to be proud of course. But I think, you know, whereas a step backward might be seen as, oh, you know, if you are stepping down from being a manager onto an individual contributor, you know, you have maybe a salary cut. You are seen as lesser of being a role model for others. So, but I guess in my interpretation, it's more of being happy with what you're doing.
Okay, so that's super interesting. You view advancement, or maybe the opposite of, as having to do maybe a little bit more with like flexibility and like happiness.
I think so. At this
Would
point in
we
time,
say, would we say that executives are the happiest people we deal with on a regular basis? I'm not sure.
um,
I'm not sure. That's an interesting way though to think about it. So there's Lyndsey, I'm interested for this kind of the same question, and I'll answer last, but what would you consider to be a step forward, and what would you consider to be a step backward?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, especially being somebody that manages people, a step forward would be whatever role accentuates your strengths. So it might be something that on paper is a lesser title, but if it's calling more of your strengths forward, then to me that is 100% a progression in your career, because it's putting you where you're going to succeed the best and where you're going to be the happiest. So yeah, I think for me, it's just whatever role really calls out your strengths.
So let me put you on the spot. You
Yes.
have been with BBG for like 2.5+ years, maybe more, maybe 3 almost. You've only recently started working more on branding style projects. Would that kind of fall into that category for you if you were to get more of those types of projects? Does that look like progress because you're handling or involved in more of the process, but it also kind of pairs with something that you love?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think for me, I'm sort of an interesting case where I'm a project manager, but I've always worked at such small boutique agencies that I've sort of had to be a little bit of everything. So in the process of becoming a project manager, I also became a brand strategist, or this, that, and the other, just because I've always worked on lean teams and everybody had to be multi-layered and multi-talented. And so I think, yeah, a role that would allow me to sort of dive into those layers is definitely a progression.
That's an awesome bridge, because that's exactly what Juan and I were talking about for the 3 minutes before we started this, which was small team versus big team, and the roles and responsibilities that you may typically see the smaller the team. I think it's fair to say that the smaller the team, unless a very small, incredibly niche group of people come together to start something and say, we are only going to focus on this skill for this. Outside of that, because there are companies like that, and there are little small groups that focus on very specific things. But I would say that I'd agree that the smaller you are, the more you have to do within your role and responsibilities, no matter the title. And I think that that goes all the way down from junior to whatever it would be, director of, or senior, or junior. The larger you get, starts to introduce all sorts of titles in the middle, which over the years has become to be known as middle management for the most part, which is people who just connect the doers and the business related needers. Terrible descriptions, but that's like that's what it is it's the people who just act to make sure that it goes from doing to executing. And I know that in 2023, almost all tech companies are focusing on eliminating that tier of role or title and putting the doers directly to the users, or like the internal users. Typically, and so my thoughts with that I wanted to kind of bring up are, does it even matter if you have titles if you're at a small company outside of maybe the general department you would be in? Does it matter if someone is senior or junior or middle? And I know, Juan, one of the things that you had mentioned to me really early on is like, you don't love titles. And I'm interested to know more about that now that we're specifically talking about that.
Yeah.
But I would say same thing for Lyndsey. As you work with people who have different titles, how does that kind of maybe change the interaction or things like that? So Juan, go first, and then Lyndsey follow it up.
I think generally I've never been a fan of labels in general. So I think that, just like from a personality standpoint, I've never been a fan of labeling types of people and, having them in a corner to be judged by a certain lens. So maybe that's one reason. Another reason is the thing you mentioned about middle management and how many unnecessary roles there need to be in larger teams or agencies or companies that really don't fit the need of the doers or the executors that well. I find that sometimes that creates more friction to, lead to mistakes or misunderstandings. It's like a big game of telephone, right? By the time you get to the end, like words and interpretations are skewed by the messengers. So maybe that's one reason. And another reason could be, at smaller agencies, you wear a lot of hats, is what I'm hearing. So your title could be digital designer, but you could be working on print stuff if the demand is there and nobody else could take charge. But you could, of course, do it, right? A design is design nonetheless. But I think it's just in that kind of middle gray area, especially in larger teams, where I really start to have a distaste for it. But I'm not against labels and categorization when it comes to skill level. I think that's necessary, and I think it's fine.
Okay, I would say I have thoughts on this both internally and on the client side. Internally, I would say I'm pretty partial to titles in terms of the difference between a senior designer versus a junior designer. To me, when we get a project and I'm going to decide who I want on the project, to me, it's much less of what your title is and much more of, is this in your wheelhouse type of thing. So again, I'm just trying to call to your strengths, and I'm not really worried about your experience level. And then I would say on the client side of things, I look far more at tenure with the company as opposed to the title, because somebody could come in as a senior project manager on their side, but they started at the company a month ago, so they don't actually have the knowledge, to back it up, sort of thing. And so to me, on the client side, tenure is much more important than a title.
How do you know that? Or do you normally get that in a meeting, or do you have to like research it on LinkedIn?
LinkedIn. I always look at LinkedIn. Whenever there's a new person, I'm on their LinkedIn in 5 seconds.
That's the first place that people that are looking to hire us look to, is LinkedIn. Is people just go there and check out how long we've been working, where we've worked, things like that. So I want to jump back to the first thing that we were talking about too, which is like forward progression and backward progression. I think that and it goes a little bit, Juan, to what you were talking about with maybe a little more flexibility as you get a little bit older. And I think that mentality has something to do with like earning your, like you've done the time that you can now, it doesn't maybe take you as long to do something, or And so there can be a little bit more balance there because you're become more of an expert in that. And so you can have a little more flexibility. People pay more for experts versus, you know, non-experts. And then sometimes that comes with length of time, but also that really is clear in design with skills, like bring it to the table. I think that there's a couple ways that people look at this currently. And I can tell you literally today, I got a resume that had 3 bullet points of experience, and it was apprenticeship, creative director, internship, in that order. And so it seems like that's kind of jumping the whole ladder in one resume and then ending back, like jumping all the way to the top of the mountain and coming all the way back down. BBG has had interns who have left after their intern/apprenticeship and immediately have changed their LinkedIn to creative director. Do I think that that is a little bit dangerous? Yes, just because for people looking at your profile, that doesn't exactly match. You can't really just, I mean, people do, but you can't just declare that you have a master's from Harvard and have a master's from Harvard. That's, people do it, but that's not exactly, I think it's much more dangerous when you're lying about experience levels. So what would we think, just for a designer, let's just start with designer, because I think there are probably more tiers of this than in some other spaces. Not only do we have product design, graphic design, user experience design, branding, industrial design, experiential design. You know, there's an unlimited list. We also then have apprentice, junior, mid-level, senior, art director, creative director, and maybe a managing team lead of something, or like a chief creative officer at a really big company. What would we think when we talk about those things? And I'm interested to hear, Lyndsey, from your perspective, what are your expectations of someone who would be like an apprentice or a junior?
I think the main thing being independence. I wouldn't expect an apprentice to be able to do next to anything alone. And so I would take that into account. Any project I put them on, that it's essentially double time, because I'm going to have somebody else on that project as well. But somebody who's more junior, depending on how many years they have to back up that title, I should have a level of comfortability assigning things to you that you can do solo.
Yeah. And I think that aligns pretty closely with what I would expect as well. The difference being, at a small shop like ours, I look for people who have more levels of independence, because I would expect that people are going to need to learn on their own, because there isn't always the ability to pair someone with someone. Same thing with remote. It's the hardest hitting for junior because you are not sitting next to someone all the time. I think I would consider junior to even still be maybe up to 5 years experience. I know that that's not what the community would think. The community would think that it's 1 year, but it's not. That's not really I don't think, to me, I don't think that it's that fast. But I would expect a junior to be able to pick up a lot of the day-to-day fill in the gap work that is not coming in from, hey, go creative direct or art direct this whole thing by yourself, deal with the clients by yourself. I think that junior is finally getting comfortable talking to clients, but probably still isn't able to take those calls solo. What about mid-level? Is that even a thing? Where would a mid-level person sit?
I'm not even sure I recognize mid-level as like an actual thing. I mean, you're either a junior who's truly like I align with you, Jason. On to me, junior is 5 years or less. So to me, you're either a junior and you have 5 years or less, or you've hit the 6 year mark. You've got a portfolio to back it up behind you, and then I consider you more on the senior side of things.
I would agree with that too. I don't think I think companies have to have mid-level designers so that they could essentially fake promotions. I think that's been the biggest pre-pandemic. Having an increase in job title was the number one thing that people were looking for to consider their career moving forward. And I think if you can have a junior creative director or a group creative director, you can even still chop the pieces of the pie up into triple the amount of pieces of the pie. And that's why I think a lot of these job roles happen. I almost feel like junior, mid, and senior are just designer, and you're learning and you need to know which end of the spectrum the person is on. But I would say a senior should be able to be leading those calls. You can count on them to assign things to them, and they should be able to knock it out. They have experience with projects like this so that they're able to come in and mostly be able to just go. A little bit more independence. I don't think that they would need to rely on as much of a team to knock certain things out as more junior on that spectrum. But I think I would agree. And I would say that you can stay a senior designer for a long time. You could potentially stay a senior designer from 5 years to 25 years, depending on how many people are on that team, what the responsibilities are. But this is where it starts to change a little bit. Art director, creative director, and maybe things above it. So I can tell you that when I worked, I was on my third job, and I was at the first job, I was doing everything as essentially an apprentice. It was my first job, but I was developing, marketing, answering the phone, trying to make back-end technology work, doing everything. I learned a lot, but I also wasn't an expert of any of those pieces except learning more on interface. When I went to my second job, same kind of thing. I was growing. At that point, I was actually leading 11 people. And I was still just designer, but I was leading a team of 11. And I think that was more so because they needed somebody to actually organize the chaos versus me moving up in my career. But it was really helpful to see it. Then when I started applying for jobs and I was looking at art director and creative director, that's where I started to see interesting subtleties in what companies were looking for and what they would maybe consider that role to responsibility to actually entail. I remember having meetings with creative directors at big companies, and I was saying, how much of your role is meetings versus doing? And they were like 100% meetings, 0% doing. And I was kind of shocked by that at the beginning, thinking, how could you be a creative director and do 0% of the doing? I think that's a little too much disconnected for me. And I don't think that's how I ever want BBG to run. I would love to have a finger in the pulse at all times. But it surprised me that there's definitely those two paths we talked about, which is you can grow up and guide younger, or you can decide to say, I want to stay really focused on being an expert doer. And a lot of times that ends up becoming kind of a consultant role where you just say, I am the expert, but I don't want to project manage. Plug me in when you need the expertise. So I think that that's where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. But from a creative perspective, I'll start on art director and creative director, and then I'm interested to hear. Actually, Juan, putting you on the spot, what do you think an art director's responsibilities are, and what do you think a creative director's responsibilities are?
Yeah, I think an art director for me would be leading sort of the aesthetics and values that a team would kind of live and work by. And a creative director is more of a sort of processes and kind of more like how we do things instead of why. In that aspect, again, I've talked to very few who are open about their process when it comes to their roles. So this is coming from my very limited knowledge, but that's what I would assume it would be.
Okay. Lyndsey, because we're small, we're slightly different in that. But what would you think? What would you say that at BBG the creative director should be doing and an art director should be doing?
I think mine kind of aligns a little bit with yours. Juan, is art director for me is you're still very heavily involved in the doing, like the actual art of design, you are still in that. The creative director for me is much bigger picture. You're thinking about the project almost on the project management sort of level, but then also bigger picture. Like you're thinking about how does this project lean into the other aspects of the client's brand or any other pieces of the puzzle on the client side that maybe we're not touching. But just again, keeping that really big picture and not so honed in on the art itself.
Yeah, I would say for within BBG, because we kind of have two art directors and I act as the creative director, but it mishmashes. I think the responsibilities there is that the art director needs to carry a lot of the load to make sure that we can get to the touch points, and the creative director is more so there at critical junctures to try to point or maybe bring additional experience or thoughts or knowledge about the client into the mix to say, I love this, but also let's think about this before we present, maybe opens up the view a little bit. But I would agree with both of you that an art director should still be defining the visual appeal. I think the creative director, to me, is much more a role that adds the flavor to who that agency is. And if you have 10 creative directors, that's the combined flavor that you get from that agency. Is this is who we want to be, this is what we're interested in, and kind of continuing to guide that for all the junior, even senior art directors and stuff under, but kind of guiding and saying, this is the type of creative house we're going to be. I think that creative directors have to deal a lot more with internal corporate stuff than art directors. I mean, again, this is going to be different at every place, but I would say that a creative director would probably be sitting in a meeting saying, our budget for 2023 is this, and here's how it's going to break down for the staff. I would say art director and below is usually not privy to that type of information, or it's not their main concern.
Yeah, I would say the creative to me has a component of strategy, specifically business strategy, whereas to me, the art direction side's never touching that part of it.
And I think if the company too has a product or is not a creative agency or consultancy like we are, that creative lead within the company has to be selling the brand internally to everybody. And I think that that is an extra tough role dealing with non-creatives, because then you're almost talking all business. It's a lot less about what does this creative look like, but you're basically out there selling for your team to keep doing the good work that they do internally. I think externally you have agencies that hire big name creative directors to become part of their agency, and it's half PR and it's half that's how we're going to get clients, because the clients know that name and would feel comfortable working with that person. So there's something interesting there. I think that it would be different at every place that has a creative director. To me, I don't think anyone under 20 years experience is a creative director, just because you have to be able to negotiate internal corporate baloney. And I don't think the experience is there without 20 years experience. It might be there, but I think that you kind of have to be there, do it before you get there. So we're coming up on time. I know it goes fast. Any last thoughts about this to wrap this up?
I guess my final thoughts would just have to be seeing more value in kind of what titles and roles need to play when it comes to, the hierarchy of teams and how people work together. I still don't have the greatest love for, like you guys were saying, like, is there even a mid-level designer? I don't know who's to say. But I think just hearing the perspectives of you guys was really encouraging into like, skill sets and skill levels are, a great asset to view people's strengths and agilities. And so I think that's a great perspective to have as you grow and kind of learn, as I am still with every call, So yeah, that's what I would take away from this.
Lyndsey, do you have a closing thought?
I think for me, my closing thought would really just be, again, I'm with you, Juan. I've never been a titles person, and especially somebody who works in project management, we're sort of put in a box by the title of our position, because right off the bat, you're called management. Regardless of if it's your first year as a project manager or your 20th year as a project manager.
And you also have to know every department. You have to know about every department. You have to effectively be at minimum a junior of every department that we work with so that you could be successful.
Yeah. So I would say focus far more on your skill set, honing in your strengths, making sure you're constantly learning more about your strengths and the things you're curious about. And I think, the true progression comes with that. It doesn't come with whatever title's on the paper.
I totally agree. And that's my closing thought, is that I don't really think the titles matter. I think they matter much more in a business sense and I hate to say this, when people see the term, there's respect that comes along with it. So if all of a sudden everyone changed their title to executive director of lunch or whatever you change it to, there would be more respect that comes along with that, but only from a client. I don't think internally it would do anything or matter. In fact, BBG took titles off our business cards after the first round because we all decided, who cares? Like, if we're going to do this project, we're all going to do it. And it doesn't matter who's senior. There's a lot of times we go into meetings and people don't necessarily know that I own the company and I'm in the meeting and am still talking about how I'm going to work within the project. And a lot of times sometimes I talk about it and sometimes I don't. I think it's situationally dependent if the knowledge needs to be known, but I never come in and I'm like, please, I'm the creative director of this company. And so this is what goes along with it. So I think that's one closing thought. And the second thing, which goes back to Juan, your opening thought about what title do you need in your career when along the way, and what is a step forward and what's a step backward. I would say don't worry or care about that at all and focus on skills, because that is going to be what gets you into a role of those requirements versus length of time. There's definitely a lot of people in creative who fail up, which is you were a bad junior designer, you were a bad mid-level designer, now you're managing people and you might be an amazing manager, but you didn't have those skills before. And that's something that over 25 years, I've seen people do it, and it's just they've been in the industry for 25 years. I much more would rather look at what skills you bring than length of time you bring. And I think that that's really important to how you fit into the team. Anyone can be a leader, and that could be junior, that could even be apprentice. There have been apprentices we've had at BBG who've stepped up and have shocked everyone by leading a presentation and knocking it out of the park. And it changed all of our the way we would look at what that person could add to the team, even though they were still apprentice for 6 more months. So it's kind of an interesting it's an interesting way to look at it, is by what skills and how you work with your teammates. I do want to talk about the 6 types of designers, which we're gonna end this, and then I'm gonna restart in if Juan or Lyndsey, you want to stay in, but I want to keep this one short. So gonna wrap that there. We're up to 4 subscribers on YouTube, up from 1. So whoever you are, thank you a lot. And we will see you at Design Summer Sessions number next. I don't know what it is, 7 or 8 is next. I think it's 7.
Yeah.
So thank you again, Lyndsey. Thank you, Juan. And to all the designers out there, if you have any questions, please comment and get in touch with us.